All of the lessons in the month of June are the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. We started with his being sold into slavery last week, but we're continuing that story. Joseph, the favorite son of his father Jacob, he's 17 years old when the story begins here. He is hated by his brothers because he is the favored son of his father, to the point that they sell him to a caravan of traders who take him to Egypt. And that was from the 37th chapter, last week's lesson. And this week is from the 39th chapter, where he comes to Egypt. There's an interesting little departure from Joseph's story, which is chapter 38. I'm not going to go into it because it sort of stands on its own, but I said last week, the whole story of Joseph is like a soap opera, and so is chapter 38, which is about Judah. Judah is Joseph's brother. He's the fourth oldest of Jacob's 12 sons, and the 38th chapter is a story about Judah, the mistakes he continues to make, his sons make. It introduces an interesting character, Tamar, who's a Canaanite who is incorporated into the lineage of Jesus, along with other Canaanite women like Ruth and Bathsheba and Rahab. So it's an interesting story. I encourage you to read it. I'm not going to go into it. I think, though, that it does make the point that at the same time that God is working in the life of Joseph, he's working in the lives of those family members that he left behind, like Judah in Canaan. We have, I think that to start this lesson today, we can all acknowledge that everybody at some point in time has experienced some tough times. Some of us are experiencing tough times now, and we pray for them. Sometimes these tough times are the result of poor choices that we make, and you can understand to some degree why things are happening for you. Things aren't going smoothly. Sometimes we own those mistakes we make, and sometimes we blame our wives, but we find an excuse that we excuse our behavior, or we don't own up to the mistakes we make. But there's some tough times that are caused by poor choices we make. There are other tough times that we experience because that's just the vagaries of life. Stuff happens, We get a bad medical diagnosis, or in this last week, I've been particularly moved by a situation. Last Sunday evening, they had a memorial little picnic for Bob and Betty Kennedy. And while we were there, we got a call from a young couple. A young couple been married a number of years. The girl had cancer when she was in her 20s. They didn't think she'd ever get pregnant. Sort of, complete surprise. She did get pregnant. And last Sunday afternoon, she went to the hospital and delivered a stillborn baby. It's just tragic, and again, it's things that just happen. Nobody's fault, just things happen. Bad things happen, even to good people. Then there are another category of tough times that we experience where we or someone we know is just a victim, an innocent victim of the sins of someone else. And that's what we're going to see in our story today. This last spring, a case that's sort of somewhat similar to the case we have here in Joseph's story. I'm a lobbyist. I work in the Capitol. I have for decades now. But there was a terrible situation. A young girl, beautiful young girl, worked at the Capitol. She reported that a lobbyist had given her at a reception a date rape drug and had taken advantage of her. And it was in the newspapers, and legislators made speeches on the floor and all this kind of stuff. And everybody was just aghast at it. It's a terrible, awful thing to transpire. if in fact it happened. The young man that was accused lost his job. He'd only been lobbying. This was his first session that he had been a lobbyist, but he'd worked in the Capitol about 10 years. He and his wife moved in a matter of days to Florida. Got out, he got fired. The law firm that he worked for, I know the guy who established it's a great guy, a preacher's kid. He's a deacon, wonderful person. He lost clients over it. DPS did a study, an investigation, and in 3 weeks they determined that the whole thing was a fabrication. She had gotten in a bad way, embarrassing way. Rather than owning it with her family, she came up with this fabrication. And the DPS concluded 3 weeks into it that there was nothing to it, and the only victim was the accused young man. But nobody made speeches apologizing to him. He's still out of work. So sometimes we're the victim of other people's bad behavior. And that's the kind of tough times that Joseph is experiencing here. I tell those stories because Joseph was 4,000 years ago. A lot's changed in 4,000 years, but people haven't changed all that much. It's not that hard to relate to Joseph and the other characters in this soap opera that we have. Anyway, the sooner or later, every person is going to experience tough times, and that can test our patience. It can cause us pain and hurt. It can change our lives sometimes. And it can make even believers wonder, why me, Lord? Why is this happening? Why are you allowing this to happen? Why aren't you responding more quickly to what I need? And faith itself can sometimes be called into question. Anyway, we have a series of lessons that deal with this later in this quarter when we get into the book of Job. And we have some very interesting lessons to look forward to here later in the quarter. Suffice it to say that some proponents of Christianity, and I have these prosperity preachers in mind, teach that, Christianity is like a vaccine that inoculates you from anything bad happening to you, And it's a shame, because when real life experiences happen and you have those tough times, you can't square it with that teaching, that kind of preaching. Other Christians that are more biblically grounded still, though they know that God never promised us a rose garden here on earth, that we will have those vagaries of life. Nonetheless, when they're persistently wounded by tough times, even Christians can have doubts planted by Satan as to their faith and the strength of their faith and the reality of their faith. There are passages in the Bible that tell us that there is divine protection. I'm thinking particularly of one that I like, the 91st chapter of Psalms. Let me read just the first 4 verses. It says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For it is He who delivers you from the snare and the trapper, and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His pinions, and under His wings you may seek refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and a bulwark." There are verses like that that assure us of God's divine protection. But there are a lot more and more numerous passages that we can look to that make it clear that God's grace more often enables us to endure and to walk through the problems that we do encounter. Jesus warned His disciples to expect ill treatment if He Himself received ill treatment, his disciples ought to expect the same thing and not be surprised about it. For the 2,000 years of the New Testament church, we have seen mockery and persecution and even martyrdom. Even in the world today, there are places in the world where there's real physical persecution of Christians. That's the Christian experience. And that gracious protection that's talked about in passages like Psalms 91 is overwhelmingly cases where spiritual protection is promised. As Paul says in Ephesians 6, a shield from the slings and arrows of the evil one. That's why in the Lord's Prayer, we don't pray that we'll be protected from trouble, but we do pray that we'll be delivered from the evil one, the evil that confronts us. And throughout it all, we're promised that we'll never be alone in it. We always will have our Heavenly Father with us in the form of the Holy Spirit. Well, in this lesson, we pick up with Joseph, who has a roller coaster of highs and lows in his life. Again, as I said, it's the 39th chapter. It focuses on the injustice that he experiences, somewhat like what I talked about with the experience down in Austin. Joseph's brothers, as I said, sold him into a caravan of traders. They trade him to a high Egyptian official in Egypt. The brothers go back and tell their father Jacob that wild animals have killed him, so he thinks he's dead. That's where we dropped off last week. Now we pick up, and let me start with the first verse, and it says, when Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, Potiphar, Pharaoh's chief officer, the commander of the royal guard, and an Egyptian, purchased him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph. First of all, there's a little question in the translation of what Potiphar's job is, whether maybe the head of the royal guard, sort of like the Secret Service, got Joseph and then traded him or put him with Potiphar, who was over all of it. There's some translations that say Potiphar's job was more as the head butler for all of the royal household, something like that. But in any event, he is a high-ranking official in the government, and that's who Joseph is traded to. But the second verse says, the Lord was with Joseph. This is interesting because this chapter begins with that statement and it ends with that statement. And he became a successful man and served in his Egyptian master's household. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything he did successful. Potiphar thought highly of Joseph, and Joseph became his assistant. He appointed Joseph head of his household and put everything he had under Joseph's supervision. From the time he appointed Joseph head of the household and of everything he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian household because of Joseph. The Lord blessed everything he had, both in the household and in the field. So he handed over everything he had to Joseph and didn't pay attention to anything except the food he ate. I can relate to Potiphar too. If I only got one good decision to make, I'm going to spend it on what I'm having for lunch, That's sort of where he is. But Joseph is a blessing to Potiphar and to Potiphar's household. We'll see later he's a blessing to his jailer and eventually to all of the Egyptian country. God promised Abraham that he would bless Abraham and Abraham's descendants would be a blessing to all the families of the world. The story of Joseph is sort of a first down payment on that promise that was made to Abraham. Well, as we see here, and as I read these scriptures, I think there's teachings all along through here. But one immediately is the providence of God, I think. The fact that someone comes to Egypt, he's a slave, and he almost immediately finds himself in a situation where he is elevated is God's hand at work, God's providence. And time again we see it in this passage. Joseph purchased by Potiphar, I just can't believe his dumb luck. And the passage tells us that it's not. The Lord was with Joseph, just as the Lord was with his grandfather Isaac and his uncle Ishmael that we talked about last week, how God was with Jacob and preserved his life and made him successful. The Lord is with them. The difference with Joseph, as I said last week, and the reason that it's easy for us to relate to him is that Joseph's interaction with God is not so direct as those who preceded him. Hey, Nancy, y'all come on in, get a donut hole and some coffee. Joseph's ancestors, his father wrestled with God to the point that he walked the rest of his life with a limp. His grandmother, Sarah, chatted with God. His great-grandfather Abraham walked with God, it says. They had sort of supernatural experiences with God. Joseph doesn't have that, but God is still with him in the way that God is with us. And Joseph is able to recognize that, acknowledge that, and act on it. By the way, in this one chapter 39 of Genesis, it says that the Lord is with Joseph. That every time we see, I've mentioned this before, but every time you see Lord spelled in all capitals, small all capitals, that's God's proper name. That's Yahweh, and it indicates calling somebody by their first name. That is the Lord that is with Joseph. That's mentioned these many times in the course of Joseph's story. So the phrase "the Lord was with Joseph," which is repeated 4 times in this chapter, is obvious by the fact that he's blessed by God. Even in the situations that he finds himself, he's blessed, and others around him are blessed by him. But doesn't mean that he doesn't suffer trials. He does, and we will see those. The Lord was with Joseph, and whether or not we are aware of it or acknowledge it, God's omnipresence is always with us as well. And it's important. It's an important truth to remember. Even when we may feel like we are abandoned, we are not. God is there. And although things may look out of control, nothing is out of God's control. That I think is a basic teaching of this story we have. The evidence of God being with Joseph is how successful he was. Everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. He had success, and it was obvious to the people that saw him and watched him. Even Potiphar, who's a pagan, and we can assume not all that familiar with the God that Joseph believed in, he could see that the Lord was with him and that he was blessed because of his God. He could tell that, as 2,000 years later James wrote, every good and perfect gift comes from God. They could see that this success came from Joseph's God. And you also have to assume that they didn't come to that conclusion if Joseph was taking credit for all of the good things that were happening. He had to be giving God the credit along the way to Potiphar and the people that lived in Potiphar's household for them to come to that conclusion. But I do think that it's a mistake if we think that success, earthly success, is always and only the indication that God is with us. There are other ways that we know that God is with us even when we don't have success. The peace that passes all understanding. A more courageous faith when we need to stand up for our faith. A secure hope when doubts do enter our minds, and the assurance that we have in the faith. Just a few of many other ways that God being with us is known. And also, I think it's good to note that Joseph doesn't have to have a soapbox and a bullhorn to announce that he's a man of God. It radiates from him. And I think that's another way that we don't have to call down lightning like some of the previous stories that we've seen to demonstrate it. It's radiated from us if we are living in Christ, as Paul says. Paul said when he wrote to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, the second chapter, he said that quote, through us spreads in every place a fragrance that comes from knowing him. Jesus put it that men and women of God are like salt of the earth and light in darkness. Christians normally have a positive impact on the situations they're in and the people they come into contact with. And that's the case with Joseph. Salt and light and fragrance come from the inside of a transformed life, and that's a work of God. Another thing that I think that the lesson shows up to this point is that Joseph, thrown into that dry cistern, a holding tank, so to speak, by his brothers, he was stripped of his coat of many colors. We talked about that last week. It was an indication of the great favor he had with a father that doted on him, but it also was a sign of his identity as the preeminent person in the family, the one who would carry on the covenant relationship with God. He was stripped of that. He was stripped of his freedom. He was, perhaps he thought, stripped of being that one of promise, that son of promise and his identity. And life, the tough times in our life, can strip us of a lot of things, but it can't strip us from the self-respect that's gained from knowing that we did the right thing for the right reason. It can't strip us from the presence of God. It can't strip us of God's comfort that's always available and God's love. And another thing it can't do is it can't strip us of character. And that's what we really see in this story with Joseph. He maintains his character regardless of being removed from his homeland, regardless of losing his freedom, regardless of being a slave and then later a prison. His character shines through. I like a story. The old football coach at Texas, Darrell Royal, since passed away, but one time he was interviewed and he said, you're doing a great job of molding character of these young men playing football. We've got a football player over here. Darrell Royal said, I don't mold character. He says, by the time they get to me, all football does is expose whether they've got character or not. Their character came from their mamas and daddies. Well, 17-year-old Joseph, he gets there. He's got character, but it continues to develop. He has a character that God forges on the anvil of adversity that molds him into being the person that will fulfill the purpose that God has for his life. And that is to be this covenant carrier to the next generations of God's chosen people, but also to be, a world leader in the world that they know at this time and place. As Jesus said, Luke 16, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will be dishonest with very much. We see in every step of Joseph's life, he is trustworthy with what's given to him. And so when the time comes for him to be entrusted with a covenant relationship with God, are we as Christians to be the carriers to the next generation of the gospel message? We've been prepared for it. And we see that Joseph is. Anyway, that's a lesson, I think, from Joseph's life. We also see here that Joseph is a dreamer and an interpreter of dreams. His father Jacob was a dreamer as well. Another dreamer of our lifetimes, Martin Luther King Jr., said that he had a dream of a time when all men would be judged equally by their character, the content of their character, he said, rather than the color of their skin. Joseph's brothers were disqualified from being leaders of the family because of their lack of character. But Joseph proves to be worthy of being this covenant carrier to the next generations because he did have that character, and he continued to develop that character. And we see it demonstrated as this story continues. Let me pick up where I left off in this passage. It says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. This is only the 6th time in the book of Genesis where someone's physical attribute was indicated. But it says he was well built and handsome. That's all that's in the Bible. The Jews today have what's called the Midrash, I think it's the way you pronounce it, but it's a really ancient commentary on the scriptures. And in the Midrash, it says that Joseph, first of all, that Potiphar's wife was also very beautiful, and Joseph was so handsome that when he walked through the kitchen, that the maids would accidentally cut themselves and drop the dishes. He was so handsome. I mean, it's a real bodice buster, you know. It's like I said, it's a soap opera. But anyway, he's well built and he's very handsome. So you can draw a mental picture. And it says, sometime later, his master's wife became attracted to Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." Not very subtle and not really very seductive. It's more of a command. Someone who has more authority making a command to someone who has lesser authority. But Joseph does not succumb to it. It says in the next verse, he refused and said to his master's wife, first of all, "With me here, my master doesn't pay attention to anything in his household. He's put everything he has under my supervision. No one is greater than I am in this household, and he hasn't denied me anything except you, since you are his wife. How could I do this terrible thing to him?" First of all, he appeals to her using the ethics of Egypt. He uses the logic. How can I be unfaithful to someone who has entrusted me, who trusts me? How can I break that trust? Then he says, and sin against God. He takes it then to a moral level, not an ethical level, but a moral level. How can I be unethical, but how can I be immoral? And he puts it on that level. Nonetheless, the next verse says, every single day she tried to convince him, but he wouldn't agree to sleep with her or even to be with her. Some translations say, or to be alone with her. She brazenly hounds Joseph. It sounds, again, maybe 4,000 years ago, sounds very modern in our age of the Me Too movement and our awareness of sexual harassment and all. But Joseph knows that it's wrong. Proverbs 6, if you read it, 20 through 26, deals with adultery, which will later be the 7th of the 10 Commandments that Joseph's descendants received about 400 years later. But this proverb says that adultery steals what is most priceless in a family. It says that it destroys marriages, and it says a person who commits adultery, quote, destroys himself. Right relations with God should be mirrored and reflect themselves in right relations with other people as well. And so Joseph turns away from Potiphar's wife because he knows it's the wrong thing to do. He knows that because he remembers the teachings that he received from his father and his grandfather. He knew both his father and his grandfather as a young boy. And what he was taught, he incorporated into his life. That's called integrity. And people of integrity immerse themselves in God's instruction, and they grow roots into honesty and kindness and right behavior. There's another psalm that says that. The first psalm that we have. Wait a second, I think I I think I printed it out so that way I don't have to put my cheaters on to read. It says, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in steps with the wicked, or stand in the way of the sinners, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They're like chaff and with the wind that blows it away." Intimacy with God will result in integrity in the way we live our lives. I think it's worth noting too on this how tactful Joseph is. You know, we talked last week about maybe Joseph wasn't all that tactful in telling about the dreams that he had for his future to his brothers, how he did that. Maybe he could have been more tactful. Well, he's very tactful here. He doesn't try to shame Potiphar's wife, and he appeals to her inherent sense of right and wrong. It doesn't work, but he tries it. And even when he calls it a sin and puts it on a moral plane, he doesn't allow racial or ethnic issues to come into play. He doesn't use that word. You'll notice he says it would be a sin against God. He doesn't use Lord, Yahweh, his God. He uses the generic term for deity, so she can interpret it however she wants to. He said it's morally wrong. So he's tactful with what he says, but again, as I say, it didn't work. And so he's careful not to ever be alone with her. You know, Billy Graham at the beginning of his ministry made it a rule that he would never be in a room alone with a woman other than his wife, and he adhered to that all the time. Even when he would go to a hotel room, he would have other people go in, make sure nobody was in there before he went in. Because he knew how damaging to his ministry any even appearance of impropriety would be. It sort of made fun of Vice President Pence because he adhered to the same rule, but it's not a bad rule if you're in public life especially. So what we have here, though, is another teaching that just because you do the right thing doesn't mean that doing the right thing will always lead to physical relief of temptations and bad results. The offer that's made to Joseph by Potiphar's wife is undoubtedly tempting. The act could be accomplished in secret. You can just hear Satan whispering in Joseph's ear. If nobody knows it, nobody will be hurt. Satan still uses those same whispers. You can hear Satan say, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do," or in this case, when you're in Egypt, do as the Egyptians do. You're not back where your family is now. You don't have to abide by the same rules. We know that Joseph is unmarried yet. He probably has not ever had sexual relations yet. You can hear Satan saying, "You're a grown man, act on your natural desires, God-given desires. Why be a prude, But although those must have been whispered in Joseph's ear, he resists it. He doesn't act on it. He knows that it's wrong, and he knows that there's no excuse for succumbing to those temptations. As Paul would later write in 1 Corinthians 10th chapter, "No temptation has overtaken you except that is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." That's a teaching. There is no excuse that is good enough to go against God's will. And that's why we pray every Sunday and more, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Provide the mechanism, the escape route to avoid temptation. That's what we pray in the Lord's Prayer. But as the old adage goes, no good deed goes unpunished. That's the case with Joseph's story here. There are times in life when life just isn't fair. And this is one of them that is just not fair to Joseph. Let me pick up with the 11th verse. One day when Joseph arrived at the house to do his work, none of the household's men were there. She grabbed his garment, saying, "Lie down with me." But he left his garment in her hands and ran outside. He tried ethics. He tried to appeal to her ethics, her morals. He refused her advances, but finally he just has to run away. He just flees the temptation. Joseph doesn't toy around with temptation. That's a good example for us to follow. He left it behind. He flees from it. Potiphar's wife is in a position of power. Joseph is not in a position to exercise power against her. The only real power he's got is his willpower, and that's what he acts on here. He's vulnerable, and he is victimized because of it. I read a devotional one time that said, the only way God can show us that he is in control is to put us in situations that we cannot control. And so Joseph is not in control of this situation, but it's a situation that God can use as a teaching moment for all of us that he is in control. Let me pick up with the 13th verse. It says, when she realized that he had left his garment in her hands and run outside, she summoned the men of the house and said to them, "Look, my husband brought a Hebrew to ridicule us." She's foiled again. She's frustrated. She's been spurned and she's humiliated by it. And so she's angry and resentful. And so she decides to take revenge on the person that has humiliated her by refusing her advances. But also, she has to have a story, because what if Joseph goes straight to Potiphar and tells him this story? So she's got to have a story, and she's got to have some proof that her story is right, that is the truth. And so she holds on to this garment and doesn't put it down until Potiphar arrives. Says, he came to me, she's still telling her story, he came to me to lie down with me, but I screamed. In other words, he came and tried to rape me, but I screamed. And when he heard me raise my voice and scream, he left his garment with me and ran outside. She kept his garment with her until Joseph's master came home, and she told him the same thing, same story. She says, the Hebrew slave whom you brought to us to ridicule me came to me. But when I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment and ran outside. You notice here twice, both when she's talking to the household that comes and then later to her husband, she says, this Hebrew slave. She brings in a racial and a class issue. This person that's of a lower class than us, this person that's of a different ethnic background than us. So it's them or us, who are you going to side with? Me, your wife, one of us, or are you going to side with one of them, And then she says, this Hebrew slave that you brought into the house. In other words, to her husband, it's your fault. You brought this rapist into the house. You ought to take responsibility for it. So it sort of sounds like Adam in the Garden of Eden, who says to God, this woman you gave me, she gave me the apple. It's really your fault, God. It's a natural human response, I think, unfortunately. Anyway, 19th verse then picks up, says, when Joseph's master heard the thing his wife told him, this is what your servant did to me. He was incensed. It doesn't really tell us who he's mad at. He doesn't know whether he's incensed at Joseph or if perhaps he's incensed by the embarrassment of the situation, or he's incensed at his wife because maybe he knows what her character is. I doubt that any of the servants that worked in the household with Joseph every day really believed this story. They probably knew well what kind of person she was. I doubt really that Potiphar believed it, because maybe he was just angry at her. Maybe he was angry because Joseph hadn't been able to to handle the situation and avoid the public embarrassment that ensued. But if he really thought that Joseph had attempted to rape his wife, the punishment at this time for that in Egypt was death. And he doesn't have a public trial, and he doesn't execute him. He puts him in jail, actually puts him in jail in his own household, because he is over Pharaoh's political prisoner prison, and so he puts him in a jail that he has direct supervision of, probably. So it appears that he doesn't really believe this story. Nonetheless, he throws him into jail. Joseph loses his position, loses his freedom, another element of his freedom, and an injustice is done. Let me continue with the next verse. It says, Joseph's master took him and threw him into jail, the place where the king's prisoners were held. It's an interesting, I think it's a little interesting aside here, though, that Joseph doesn't defend himself. There's no trial. He doesn't get to, he's got a story of abuse and sexual harassment. He's got a story to tell, but he didn't get to tell it. And Jesus, when he was tried, he didn't tell his story either. He didn't have the power to make people say, stop, listen, let's abide by the rules of the Sanhedrin, and you bring your witnesses against me. He didn't get to defend himself either. And I think there maybe is a lesson in that. I'm not sure that we ever can defend ourselves. Our character can defend us. People that know us will know whether we're the kind of person that does something like this or not. And maybe we've lived our lives in such a way that others will want to step up and defend us and present a defense on our behalf. But I'm not sure that we ever, by just speaking up for ourselves, can defend ourselves. So all the more reason that we should live lives of integrity that will speak for themselves and that will maybe encourage others to step up and speak for us. He didn't get to tell his story, but his character did speak for him. And I think that probably the people that knew him the best knew the truth. Anyway, continue on, it says, while he was in jail, the Lord was with Joseph and remained loyal to him. Some say continued to bless him, some translations say. He caused, this is God, he caused the jail's commander to think highly of Joseph. God's favor, his providential hand, continues to be with Joseph. God will later tell the Israelites after their sojourn in the wilderness and they're about to take the promised land, he says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. That's Deuteronomy 31. God is with Joseph. He continues to be with him. Jesus promised us in the last chapter of Matthew that he would be with us always, continuously, constantly, even to the end of this age that we live in. And Joseph's story is a passage that begins with God is with Joseph, and it ends with God is with Joseph. It says that he remained loyal to him, and he blessed him, or he showed kindness to him in ways that again, that old Hebrew word hesed that we've talked about, which is loving kindness or tender mercies. God continues to treat Joseph with hesed, with that kind of loving kindness. It's not in our printed scripture today, but if you read the next two verses, it goes on to say that because of Joseph's abilities and his diligence, along with God's good favor, the result is that Joseph once more is entrusted by the jailer with supervising the prison. Once again, he's successful in everything he does. It says everything he did was successful. Faithfulness to God comes with real cost. He's faithful, and it gets him thrown in jail. But Jesus, as Jesus told in a parable, we need to count the cost of discipleship, because there will be opposition. There will be unfair treatment because of it. But God finds a way to bless Joseph nonetheless in every setting, whether he's a slave, a prisoner, or the second highest official in the land. God finds a way to bless him, and then blesses the people that are around him as well. I think it's good as we continue, and I'm about to wrap up, but it's good to know this is not just an Old Testament story. There are several. I picked one New Testament verse that sort of draws this same teaching that we get from Joseph's story. It's in 1 Peter 2nd chapter 19th verse. Says, "For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God." Goes on to say, "But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you and left you an example." You know, we don't always see how the puzzles, pieces of life fit together to make a picture. We sometimes don't know at the point of our own stories how this is going to all turn out well. But Paul assures us, as he says in Romans, the 8th chapter, 28th verse, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." He makes all those puzzle pieces come together and results in the picture that he wants us to see. And that's another teaching of this story of Joseph. I heard it said one time that those who leave everything in God's hands will eventually see that God's hand is in everything. We really see that as we continue this story of Joseph. In the end, Joseph's going to see, he may not at this particular point, but he's going to see in future lessons that he understands why these things happened. May not right now, but he will see that God's providential hand was in them, and he will see what God's plan was all along. That's our text. I think that there's some unwritten thing. You know, we always like to read between the lines, and I think there's some really good teachings between the lines of the text that we've got today too, that are sort of subtle, and they have to do with Joseph's attitude as he goes through these vagaries of life. Joseph's brothers were jealous of him. They thought that they were treated unfairly because he was treated so favorably. And they let that feeling fester to the point that they could rationalize and excuse the hatred they had for him, and even rationalize that hatred justified them murdering or selling him into slavery. Even justify them rejecting God's plan if it involved Joseph. Joseph must surely have had hard feelings about the way his brothers treated him, or Potiphar's wife, or Potiphar for that matter, or the cupbearer we're going to talk about next week who forgot about him for 2 years. He had to have some hard feelings, but he didn't let those things fester. I don't think he could have let those feelings fester and still have turned out to be the person that he did. He didn't let those fester. He didn't stew in his resentment over the things that happened to him. I think that Joseph saw each day as a gift from God, and he lived in that day. He lived in that present, in the present. He didn't live in the past. He didn't allow himself to be the victim of those things that happened before. He lived today. And because he did that, he was able to accomplish so much and to be successful. We're going to have another lesson in this quarter about Ruth. And in both the case of Ruth and Joseph, we see that God rewards hard work and diligence and commitment. Commitment to family, commitment to country, commitment to God and service to God. And Ruth is blessed with a good husband and a descendant named Jesus. And Joseph is rewarded with being the number 2 man in the most powerful country in the world. He was able to work diligently and do things to the glory of God because he wasn't living in the past, I think. Colossians 3 says, work heartily as for the Lord and not as for men. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says in the 10th chapter, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Joseph could work toward a future because he wasn't living in the past. And he didn't think of himself as being the victim. He didn't let that define him. He didn't let the fact that he was a victim define who he was. And it allowed him to be successful in the present. But that absence of baggage, that absence of resentment and victimhood and hatred is why at the end of this story we'll see that he is the person who can be forgiving, who can forgive in such a gracious and complete way that we see in the last lesson. And I think another thing, subtle lesson, this is again, it's not written in here, it's gospel according to me, but I think that we also see Joseph as the kind of person that that has mastered the art of delayed gratification. You know, in our culture today, we want instant gratification. We want the fast food line to move faster at the McDonald's. You know, we have to have a cell phone with us all the time so that we can get in touch with somebody right now, you know. We want instant gratification. We want our prayers answered right now, just the way we want them. We want them answered. And we see here Joseph waits on the Lord. He waits to let the Lord act out. He doesn't wait in idleness, though. He's not sitting around waiting for God to do something. He's waiting, but he's working and he's faithful while he's waiting for God to act. And he doesn't let the temptations of today rob him of the blessings of the future because of it. In the end of the Joseph story, we'll see a lesson that shows that obedience to God ultimately brings lasting blessings and blessings beyond what we even might imagine. We have in Joseph a great example for how to live. Someone of real integrity, somebody who lives what they believe. You know, he walks his talk. He's a great example, and it's good for us to recognize that. But that's not all that Joseph is. And that's not the real gist of Joseph's story. The real gist is that Joseph is a part of God's overall plan of salvation, of deliverance of God's people. Integrity doesn't provide for divided loyalties. That's duplicitous. And it's not a pretending. He doesn't pretend to be a man of God. That'd be hypocritical. People with integrity are whole people, and Joseph is a whole person. Their lives are able to be lived without fear, and their lives are an open book for the watching world to read. There's a progression when integrity is eroded that could have happened to Joseph but didn't. Very often, we start with asking what's the right thing to do, and then we go to what's the absolute least that's required of us, to what can I get away with. There's a progression, and we see it. We see it in all kinds of our culture today. We see lawmakers that take trips, vacations on the public dollar. We see respected preachers, men of God who proclaim to be speaking for God, and then we find out they've got another whole life over here in secret. We see it when we watch. There's a book called Integrity written by Yale theology professor, Dr. Carter, and he uses an example of he's watching a football game, a receiver dives for a ball, the slow-mo replay shows that he didn't catch it, he trapped it on the ground, but he jumps up and he says he caught it. Rather than saying, I didn't catch it, that'd be what a man of integrity would do. He'd say, I didn't catch it. The announcers say, boy, didn't he do a good job of acting like he caught that ball? You know, our culture doesn't always reward integrity. I like the story of the Great Wall of China, built to protect. It was too high, too thick for the northern tribes to get through, but over 100 years they got in 3 times by bribing the gatekeepers. You can build a great wall, but if the people on it don't have integrity, it doesn't do you any good. And I think Joseph teaches us a good lesson about, you know, we can build a lot of walls, but if we don't have integrity, it's not going to help us. And he's a great example of that. He ultimately, though, will be a deliverer of his family. He'll provide for salvation in a time of famine for not only his family, but for all of Egypt. And he's sort of a precursor of the Messiah that will be a suffering servant, but also a deliverer and ultimately glorified as such. Anyway, again, I've run on too long. I apologize.